Hello, my name is Chris Hegg. I study petroglyphs. Studied them all my life, and I'm sitting here by one that I've studied since I was probably 13 years old when I was first shown it. That time I couldn't find petroglyphs. Today I find petroglyphs while I'm sitting on my couch. I can find them in most places in the western states without ever going to them. I've got a big archive of them, and the way I got there was that when I first seen a petroglyph when I was 8, 9 years old, I think, I was fascinated with them. They're all over the place, and like this one, they're just out in the middle of nowhere. This is in a pretty remote part of the mountain range, and it's far away from most things. You'd have to walk a mile to get anywhere that has any interest for mankind, especially back then, such as a river or lake. This one happens to be by Walker Lake, but it's far away from Walker Lake now. The lake level's dropped even in white man's time. It's dropped down, but way back when, like many petroglyphs, after decades of research, I found that these petroglyphs are based in strategic locations, which now has no meaning. When you go to a site and you stand and you observe the great deserts in front of you, no matter what western state you're in, anyways, you find these out in the middle of nowhere. Some you find by springs, known hunting sites and things like that for deer and ducks and stuff, so they make sense. But a lot of them, especially the bigger sites, bigger petroglyph sites, are by nothing. There's nothing there. I've searched and searched and found nothing for a very long time until I realized that, in fact, that when they were created, they were by something. They were by ancient lakes. The time when these ancient lakes were in the entire western North American inner region was 13 to 16,000 years ago. And from that understanding of geology and researching lake levels, I found that all of these petroglyphs are at strategic locations at the ends of these lakes, not just around them. It had to be for a specific purpose. This one's near a river that would have been a very big river back then, and a lot of other ones are between the closest ends or passes of one lake to the next. A lot of lakes were not interconnected, some by rivers, but other ones, if you wanted to take a shorter route, you had to go over a hill like this, a mountain range, through a pass. And usually, of course, man traveling from point A to point B would have to have fresh water and things, and this is one of the stipulations of where a petroglyph can be found. There's a lot of other petroglyph sites. Graveyards, for one, is a petroglyph site that's unrelated sometimes to main trade routes of petroglyphs. And I say trade route because that's the reason these petroglyphs are here. It was for trade. Before man's written record, we're talking 13, 16,000 years ago, man traded supplies across the interior western North American area by way of boats, by way of the Great Lakes that were in here. These mountains that you see now in the Great Basin stretch with valleys in between, very dry valleys, and mountains looking like caterpillars going north, as one astronaut described them. Rows and rows of these. Well, that long ago, they would have been rows of islands. You'd have been floating on a boat, an ancient boat, before man supposedly floated a boat, going from point A to point B, thousands of miles inland, trading supplies, taking resources from the land, moving them out to the coastline, and taking them around the world. We're talking global travel, a global language describing this travel, at least 13 to 16,000 years ago. That's when it ended. That's when the Great Lakes receded and they could no longer do that. How do we move supplies today? The cheapest way if you don't have water, is by a highway. You don't put a highway over a mountain because it's hard to build. You don't put a railroad over a mountain. It's very hard to build. When you do have to do that, it's a very painful experience, and it costs a lot of companies a lot of money to do it, and they don't want to. It's simple physics. You move supplies that weigh something the easiest way possible. Even today, the cheapest, easiest way to move supplies with the least amount of physical equipment is floating it on the water. You can build a barge big enough to handle anything, any kind of rock that weighs 150 tons. You can build a barge, and sometimes out of reeds, and you can float it. So, very interesting that archaeologists don't see it that way, but they believe these were made by drugged up shaman, all of them. Even though the symbols are the same all around the world, they're just drugged up shaman that did this. So somehow archaeologists claim that drugged up people had a lot of energy back then, that they really wanted to do a lot of work like this. And for some reason, they all had the same visions, whether you're thousands of miles away or whatever. At the same time, you had the same visions, and that's why the symbols are exactly the same. As I've always argued, I think the theory of the drugged up shaman that was made by the archaeologists was made under heavy drug influence, more heavier drug influence than any Indian that's ever existed in the world to this day. So I think archaeologists were more stoned because the drugged up people I see today don't want to do anything. So anyways, this petroglyph is a specific petroglyph that took me a long time to decipher because I had to learn all the symbols before I could understand this. But it's got calendars on top explaining the dates. It's got markings here explaining what they did here. What this represents is there's a creek over here and a large fish. The only thing we got left now is Lahontan cutthroats as a variety of that fish, but there's giant fish that lived in the lakes, and they spawned in fresh water. They spawned up this creek when it was a pretty good sized river 16,000 years ago. And these ancients, as I call them, made rock embankments and made dams, and they actually captured the fish during spawning. And they processed them here. Up on top of this rock is grinding areas, big grinding areas. The rock finally fractured, I think, from so much use. I don't think it was time because of just the way they ground things. Anyways, they processed the fish up here. You can see the fish head and the guts. You can see the bugs flying around. This was the area where all of the waste products went off the side. Over here it shows people netting inside of the rock rings. There's the smaller petroglyphs all along here. But this elevation is just like all the elevations anywhere I go, Arizona, wherever. There was lake levels, and of course they receded as you went towards Las Vegas and down towards Arizona and Mexico. And these inner lakes flowed into each other. And then sometimes they didn't interconnect, but they had basins that were filled with lakes that water flowed into but didn't flow out of. And along all of the ends of these is where you find these petroglyphs. So my book and my future videos and such will be about topics dealing with ancient petroglyphs and why they were here, when they were here, and exactly what they mean. So, thank you very much.